Unless something dramatic happens, the next US presidential election looks likely to be a rerun of the last one. With that in mind, is Europe ready if Donald Trump once again moves back into the White House? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, two events dominated 2016. The UK voting to leave the European Union and Donald Trump's election as US president. Many pundits and media missed them both. With just over a year until he hopes to do it all again, what might a second Trump presidency mean for Europe?
The war in Ukraine, an event that sent shockwaves through Europe and beyond. The economic and political fallout has been significant. The United States has given Ukraine $75 billion directly since February 2022, a sum that Donald Trump says would have been zero had he been in office.
I will get the problem solved, and I will get it solved in rapid order, and it will take me no longer than one day.
The secret to the former president's diplomatic ability? His relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trump has made no secret about his admiration for the authoritarian Russian leader. This puts Trump at odds with the rest of Europe and highlights one of his biggest problems with the bloc, America's participation in NATO. There's one particular point of contention: money.
If you look at Ukraine, and we all feel so badly about it, but why isn't NATO putting up dollar for dollar with us? We put up $140 billion, and they put up just a tiny fraction of that.
His tirades against the organization are well documented, as is his desire to leave the treaty altogether. If the Republican is once again successful in his bid to win America's highest office, will he be emboldened to follow through with some or all of these campaign pledges?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us today from Paris is Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, a columnist at the UK's daily Telegraph newspaper. In London is Greg Swenson, chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. And in Helsinki is Henri Vanhanen, research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Greg, I'll come to you first of all. What does Trump 2.0 look like? More angry, more unhinged? Tell us what you think he'll be like.
Yeah, I don't think he'll be much different. If anything, he'll be more unfiltered, and he won't have a re-election to worry about. So, you could see a President Trump that's even louder and more likely to really stir up some anxiety with the European diplomatic class. That's for sure.
And on a personal note, Greg, you are backing Ron DeSantis. Is that correct? And what will happen if he doesn't win?
Ron DeSantis, yes. It's a long shot right now. I'd have to be honest. Trump's still doing really well in the polls, and he got a huge bump from the indictments, all four indictments, and then followed by the now famous mugshot. So that's been a fundraising and a poll boost for President Trump. But that could fade, and it's faded before. So I think it all comes down to, the next few months, especially in Iowa, which is the first caucus.
Anne-Elisabeth, to you, is Europe ready for Trump again?
I'm not sure Europe is ready for Trump again. When you look at the way they misunderstood mostly Trump the first time, however, if you go into Trump's foreign policy the last time, because we're mostly interested in foreign policy and we're also interested in IRA, the Anti-Inflation Act, all of this was much more consistent than the performance of Trump seemed to be. And one of the sort of proof of that is that the Democrats have continued his policy. If you look about the sort of, indictment of China as being an adversary, that has been continued by the Biden administration. If you look at the Middle East peace plan, the Abraham Accords, which until 3-4 days ago seemed to be going on, the Biden administration had said that they wanted to continue that. There's a number of things that Trump did that actually became American policy, even though people complained at the time and during the electoral campaign when Joe Biden was elected. In terms of IRA, we already know what it's like, and it's very likely that Trump would not change that. So this actually might mean more stability than people like to say.
Henry, Joe Biden has been a very pro-European president, hasn't he? Very proud of his Irish roots, pro-European. Trump will be quite a gear change if he were to become president again.
Well, we do remember during his last presidency that there was a certain tendency of mistrust in the transatlantic relationship. And especially NATO was constantly under fire, and all those NATO member states that were not meeting the 2% criteria of GDP for defense spending. Now, that being said, I think Europeans should be prepared better for a potential return of Trump. But that doesn't mean that you're only stepping up in defense for the sake of Trump. I mean, this is something the Europeans should be doing anyways. I mean, fulfilling the criteria that was met jointly in the Wales summit, in the Warsaw summit, and now with the Madrid summit. I think there's a clear understanding that Europeans should do a lot more. And if they do more, that can also serve the purpose of preparing themselves better for a Trump 2.0. But that being said, also, I think there's a lot of concern about will there be some kind of cuts to US aid to Ukraine if Trump once again becomes the president. I think the topic is easy cannon fodder for certain voter base in the US, but still I believe that eyeing China, I don't think even Trump could that easily just pull out of Ukraine, because that would send a wrong signal to Asia that if you are not able to support your allies and partners in Europe, then why should anybody in Asia rely on US consistency in the future too? So I think whether Trump would like it or not, he would also have to deal with Russia and Ukraine.
Well, let's look at some of the issues. I want to talk about NATO in particular. Greg, Donald Trump has hinted that he would like the United States to leave NATO. I mean, can anyone in your country contemplate that even happening?
I don't think there'd be much support for that. I mean, and I think the key word is hinted. You know, as I mentioned, President Trump is unfiltered, and he's sometimes very clumsy with his delivery. But what he actually meant, or what he was striving for, was a really good point to be made, which is that there weren't enough of the countries in NATO that were meeting their 2% of GDP obligations. So if you just try to overlook, and I know it's hard sometimes for the media and the diplomatic crowd to overlook his comments, which can sometimes be, again, unfiltered. What he accomplished in foreign policy was very positive. And I think a lot of voters in America, but hopefully even Europeans, can look back and say things were a lot better. There was more peace and more prosperity when Trump was president. You look at what he did with Russia. He, stopped the Nord Stream pipeline. He backed out of a treaty that Putin wasn't really working within the boundaries of, the intermediate nuclear treaty. The U.S. energy policy was so much better for Europe because they had cheaper energy. So his criticisms of the Germans for not spending enough on military, but also being dependent on Russian oil and gas was, a pretty good indicator of the problems and the challenges that not just the Germans, but the entire continent has. So I think if you look back at President Trump, the foreign policy was actually quite a success for him.
Anne-Elisabeth, how much concern is there in Europe that President Trump 2.0 would pull out of NATO?
I have not heard that in geopolitical circles in France, because they don't think that Trump would suddenly, at a time of unrest in the world, he would like to pull up basically the drawbridge and isolate America completely. I don't think he's the same animal. I think he likes to have the upper hand in whatever negotiation, and it is also, it can be seen, and sometimes it's reproached, especially in my own country, in France, that NATO is so strong because of the United States, and giving that up is not something that looks so typical. The other question is, who would he have around him as advisors? And we have a fair notion of the pool of geopolitical advisors, foreign policy, defense, and none of them numbers Tucker Carlson. So I'm less worried about that threat. I think he could make the threat, but I'm not sure that could happen. The other thing is also the military industrial complex in America, and it is not in their interest for the US to leave NATO.
I want to talk about Ukraine in more detail. Let's take a look at a tweet recently by Donald Trump Jr. He wrote on Twitter/X, Zelensky is basically an ungrateful international welfare queen. Henry, do you think this is indicative of his father's thinking, or was it just some might call an ignorant online rant?
Well, when it comes to US foreign policy and its consistency and the grand strategy thinking behind US decisions, I would not really read too much into Trump Jr.'s head in this case. I mean, we do remember the case with Zelensky and Hunter Biden and the Trump family, and perhaps that has caused some resentment towards Zelensky, but I would just leave it at that.
Greg, what's your reading of the Trump family's attitude to Ukraine? Is the son's online attitudes reflective of the father's?
It's difficult to predict because Trump has always been very unpredictable. But I don't think, I agree with Henry. I think a lot of this is because it's campaign season. And so they're really annoyed with the fact that the Justice Department, the FBI, the acronym agencies in Washington have really gone out of their way to protect both Hunter and Joe Biden regarding the Ukraine scandal, the Russian scandal, China, Romania, Kazakhstan, while at the same time really going after Trump and his family. So I think there is some personal scar tissue between Don Jr. and the Bidens in general. But again, it's campaign season, so they're really appealing to their base. There is a significant number of Republicans who are skeptical of the support for Ukraine, and I think that Don Jr. is just reflecting that. He's very good at appealing to his base.
And Greg, when you're talking about working American families, how interested are they in Ukraine? How much do they even care?
Not much, and that's something that's interesting about U.S. politics. When it comes to election time, foreign policy never really ranks very high. Now, there was a lot of unity after 9/11, of course, and that was a big part of Bush's reelection. But I think if you look at the issues, with wages going down consistently since Biden took over, you've got a wide open border. You've got really difficult situations in the Democrat-run cities with crime and homelessness. So there are a lot bigger issues as far as Americans are concerned, and I think especially in the working class, who are the ones that are really suffering from the inflation.
Anne-Elisabeth, I want to ask you, what would it mean for Ukraine going forward if Trump were to become president again and decided to pull the pin on all military support, all financial aid for Ukraine?
I think that would be very bad for Ukraine because at the end of the day, the effort, such as it is, because lots of weapon systems have been withdrawn, withheld, delayed, and the United States could have done more. I think there's a good argument that has been made by people who are former members of the Trump administration, people like Mike Pompeo, for instance, who used to be the Secretary of State and who has CIA experience. And that is to say that it is in the interest of America to arm Ukraine because America spends about 5% of its annual military budget on Ukraine. And for 5% of their military budget, they have practically destroyed half the available hardware in Russia. And even though there's more provisioning coming from Iran and coming from China, this is incredibly cheap. This is not expensive. You can make a case for saying that these are bargain basement prices in terms of getting rid of the adversary against which the American army mostly was preparing itself. Because, it's not against other Europeans. It's not something that's going to happen in Asia because then it's more about planes and aircraft carriers. We are talking about exactly the kind of equipment that America was building to defend itself against Russia.
Henry, what would a Trump victory in 2024 mean for the situation with Russia? I mean, we know he's got a big ego. Is the Ukraine war the kind of situation where Donald Trump would want to get involved as a mediator? We know he has spoken in glowing terms previously about Vladimir Putin. Do you think he could end up winning a peace of some sort?
Well, first on the Trump-Russia relationship, I think for him personally, the issue, even if he would agree that, which he doesn't, but if he would agree that the Russians tampered with the US elections, he would never admit that, because that would mean that he would admit that his election was shady and sort of undermining his presidency. And I think one must also remember that during the Trump administration, actually the Russia policy was quite tough and consistent when it came to sanctions, investing in European defense, and partnerships in Europe, for example, with Finland bilaterally. So even though there was this perhaps a divide between the administration's action and Trump's personal talk, the policy in Russia was consistent. Now, when it comes to Ukraine and Trump, I think if there would be a chance, theoretically, for Trump to shine as a mediator, he would probably not shy away from that. But the issue is that there will not be such a chance. And this is not the sort of crisis or war by nature that can be solved solely by an American president, unfortunately, as a mediator, because Russia would never recognize such a peace, obviously, even though Russia considers the US as its likely in this case. But to be honest, I think even Trump himself, being someone who considers his personal reputation important, would not want to enter into some kind of a bargain that would make him look bad. And in this case, with someone, with a country that is considered an adversary to the United States.
Greg, do we know where the Trump-Putin relationship is right now since Trump has been out of office? Do we know anything about it?
Very little, and I don't imagine there's any communication, of course. But again, Henry brings up a good point. Trump was much more aggressive against Russia and much more supportive of Ukraine. If you look at the Obama-Biden administration, yes, they were shipping supplies, but they were not lethal supplies or any kind of weapons. They were shipping non-lethal supplies. They wouldn't put them on flagged, American planes flying to Kyiv. It was all going to Poland and then moved into commercial trucks. And that yet when Trump came in, he started shipping Javelin missiles and other lethal equipment. Again, I mentioned Nord Stream. So he's got a real record of really standing up against Putin. So I think, there's always that difference between his rhetoric and what he actually does. And what he did was very constructive and good for Europe. And I hope we see that again if he does win the race.
Anne-Elisabeth, I want to read to you a quote from your former president, Francois Hollande. He spoke recently to Politico news website, and this is what Hollande said. What we need to prepare for is the United States distancing itself from European affairs and the possible unraveling of the transatlantic alliance. So that was his take on a possible Trump return. I mean, how worried do you think people in Paris and other European capitals will be that Trump comes back and America completely pulls back?
Well, there's an element of unpredictability with Donald Trump. But I would like to remind you of the 2017 Warsaw speech by Donald Trump, which was quite an amazing speech about Eastern Europe, and which he followed with acts, sending weapons to various countries, Poland, Estonia, others. And I think his bark is one thing and his bite is entirely different. You have enough experts in France who've been looking at this seriously, but now we get into the realm of politics, and you've never lost an election in France by being anti-American, but you can lose one by being perceived as being too pro-American. I will remind you that in, I think it's 2011, François Hollande, and then again when he was elected president, François Hollande wanted to go and intervene in Syria, and eventually because Barack Obama decided that this was not going to happen. This intervention did not happen, and at the time, everybody said, "Well, we're not as stupid as the Americans, quote unquote, and so we're not going to have an Iraq war." But if we consider what Syria was as a kind of rehearsal of what happens in Ukraine and other places, as Russia, with Russia's actions, possibly the Western world should have intervened in Syria.
Henry, some European leaders are eagerly awaiting the return of Donald J. Trump as president for a second term. Hungary's Viktor Orban is a big fan, and we know members of Poland's right-wing Law and Order party are big fans of Trump as well. Why do they like him? What is it that appeals to these parties?
Well, I think we shouldn't focus too much on these personal cults and similarities, or at least perceived similarities between country leaders. What aligns countries at the end of the day are interests. And I think in the case of Poland, and for example, Finland is another good case of that regardless of who is sitting at the White House, whether it be a Democratic or Republican president, we still have to get along. And it's an important ally for us bilaterally and also through NATO when it comes to defense procurement, defense cooperation. We know that there are US troops in Poland for the battle group. And I think this is something that the Poles have understood, that their bilateral relationship with Trump actually functioned, and that was the case with the Finns as well. So, I mean, I guess for some of these countries, a perhaps potentially hawkish Trump, if you could say that, on Russia would actually not be a bad idea.
Greg, can I just ask you, Trump has already threatened to impose 10% import tariffs across the board if he's re-elected. What would that do to European exports to your country, to the USA?
I think it would be devastating for both the Europeans as well as the American consumer, because tariffs, end up being a tax. But again, I think this is campaign bluster. I think it's an appeal to the populist right wing of the party, which is a pretty important base for President Trump. So I wouldn't worry about it. Again, it's kind of back to Elizabeth's point of differentiating between his rhetoric and his actions. I think the President Trump first administration was much better for the Europeans overall on prosperity and security than the Biden administration has been. That's pretty clear. So I think, again, we try to ignore what he says, take him literally, or don't take him literally, but take him seriously, but also look at what he does and what his outcomes are, his successes, rather than what he says, because again, he's very unfiltered that way. Yes, I'd like to have someone who's more disciplined and has some consistency between the rhetoric and the actions, but I'd rather have actions and outcomes.
Anne-Elisabeth, should European business be worried about potential tariffs?
I think there's always the possibility, and there's also the possibility of a tariff war, because the European Commission has not been inactive in terms of legislating, regulating, and sometimes taxing. So I think we have experts on both sides, and they're not the politicians. You have people who work on trade law and have worked on the details of the regulation and what can make the difference between a good situation and a really bad one for one or the other side. That has been ongoing for literally decades. I don't expect it to change that much.
Henry, I want to finish with some predictions. 2024, can you see him coming back to power? And what do you think the relationship with Europe will look like going forward?
Well, 2 weeks ago, I was in Washington, D.C. for a working visit, and I met with several different representatives of think tanks and also the administration on both sides of the aisle, so to say. And I think on Trump, the message was quite clear that you should be prepared that he might actually win the election and come back. And what I do hope on the European side is that we don't just sit down and hope for the good guy to win the elections, so to say, that we would develop an approach that really signals, for example, to the average American taxpayer why the transatlantic relationship matters. I think we're quite focused on these grand speeches on certain international bodies, but I think I was listening to H.R. McMaster in the Warsaw Summit a couple of weeks ago, and he raised that Europeans should communicate a lot more directly to the Americans why stepping up in defense is something that we're going to do and why it matters, and to highlight Russia's brutal nature and the war in Ukraine. And I think these are important messages that we need to signal regardless of who wins the election. And when it comes to who wins the election, the signal also in DC was that it's not actually now completely settled yet. There's still a chance that the court processes might take Trump down. There's still Biden's health. There's a lot of issues still that are in the air, and there are good candidates on both sides who can make it. And all depends on what happens to the big candidates. And then the other thing is that where will the big funding from each party, who will they fund? Because running a presidential campaign is expensive and exhausting.
Thanks, Henry. Greg, briefly, your prediction, is he coming back?
He has a good chance of coming back, but I think it's more Biden that we should keep our eye on. If he indeed is the candidate, then he does have a chance at beating Trump, because Trump generates so much derangement on the left and really because he's disliked by half the electorate. So it's hard to win elections. But I think if Biden drops out, which is quite a realistic possibility, then that changes the whole metric. There isn't that support for Trump in the grudge rematch or the vendetta type election. And I think that would work much better for Governor DeSantis or any of the other candidates.
Anne-Elisabeth, final question to you. Trump 2.0 in 2024, do you think it's going to happen?
I think it's more likely to happen than not to happen.
Wow. On that note, we will leave it right there. The clock has beaten us. Greg, Henry, Anne-Elisabeth, thank you all. And remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.